The darkness of consequence. Kaelin and Mieko were sparring with their practice swords in the inner court as the sun moved from below the landscape towards the highest sky. It had been a long night for Mieko as she spent most of it in Damori's arms crying, crammed onto the small bed that was made for one person, not two. Still, as sleep overtook both women, the night offered calm and a comfortable sleep. As the night washed away and daytime took over, Mieko crawled out of bed and made her way to her own bed in the royal suite. Moments later, she was summoned by servants to join King Kaelin in the inner court to continue her training. Days passed, and Mieko continued this identical ritual. She'd wait until late at night to sneak away from the queen's bedchamber. She'd make her way through the empty castle corridors in the chilly late-night air and find the servants' quarters. There she would crawl into bed with Damori and stay until the sun had just begun to rise. Then she would grudgingly crawl out of bed and trudge the hallways back to her bed. Moments later, usually just as she drifted off to sleep, a servant would interrupt and training would begin again. On this day, Kaelin and Mieko were each drenched in sweat as they approached the halfway point of their sparring session. Mieko had improved enough for Kaelin to ease up on his chastisement. Something else had changed about the king. He'd become more attentive to Mieko in the days since his declaration that Falson would marry his beloved daughter. Each time she fell, was bruised, or would grimace with pain, Kaelin was quick to respond and check on her. He'd hold her sprained foot or bruised arm gingerly, as if he were afraid to cause any more damage. Once he even held her face between his hands and blew into her eyes to release a piece of dust that settled on her cornea. Kaelin's attentiveness felt odd to Mieko. Still, it was a welcome change from his usual hard edge. Kaelin and Mieko took a moment to catch their breath. Damori entered with a stack of fresh linen towels. Her eyes met Mieko's, and the two girls perked up, their spirits lifted by the sight of the other. Mieko started towards Damori, but Kaelin pulled her back. His demeanor had grown instantly sour at the very sight of Damori. Mieko watched as her father began to seethe as he glowered at the young servant in her veil and cloak. "Father, is something wrong?" she asked. "I know you think the two of you may have grown close," he whispered, still glowering at Damori. "But Damori is like any other servant. She is jealous of you. She is not worthy of your trust or friendship." "Father, I have seen no evidence of this," she protested in a whisper. "Of course not." He turned to Mieko and smiled as he stroked her chin. "You are young, innocent, and naive. Damori is cunning. Indeed, she is so shrewd, even I had not noticed. But your future husband, Falson, has keen eyes. He has witnessed her deception, and he shall address the matter shortly." Damori turned to smile at Mieko after setting down the towels, but all she received in return was a tense look of concern. There was no way for Mieko to warn Damori without it being obvious to Kaelin. Even if she had been able to warn Damori, it would have done very little to change the course of destiny. She could only watch as Damori scurried out of the inner court. From there, she took her usual route to the main corridor and through the passageway that led to the secret room, where she could observe Kaelin's training. After she climbed the stairs, she prepared to turn the corner. She stopped to look behind her and listened to be sure no one had followed her. All was quiet. Still, something did not feel right. She shook off the chill that ran down her spine and tiptoed toward the secret room. As she neared the room, she suddenly stopped and gasped as one of the Kingsguard came into view. He was standing at the entrance to the room. The man hadn't seen her yet, but she felt trapped. She took a step back around the corner out of view and turned to flee. She ran smack into Safford and two other guards. Damori stifled a gurgle that rose from the acid in her stomach, burned her throat, and threatened to escape past her lips. She swallowed hard and composed herself. "Sir Safford? Good day." She hated that her voice trembled, but it was as good as it was going to get. "Damori," Safford began firmly. The friendly tone of his voice during their last conversation was nowhere to be found. His demeanor was cold, and even his posture was evidence of the emotional distance he wedged between him and Damori. "By order of the king, this area is hereby off-limits to you," he proclaimed. Damori's voice caught and she stammered before she stopped to take a brief pause. "Me? Off limits?" she questioned. "Perhaps I will speak to him to explain." The disappointed look in Safford's eyes gave him away. He'd secretly hoped that Damori would take the command, lick her emotional wounds and her pride, and accept it as law before exiting. He had not counted on resistance. It was unusual for anyone to push back when commanded by an order of the king. It was especially extraordinary for Damori to do so. Something had changed in her, and Safford made a mental note of it. He'd overlooked whatever spectacular event caused the change in this servant before him, but he'd be sure to watch her carefully in the future, if not for his edification, definitely for her safety. Damori watched Safford's eyes lower. There was an immediate sadness to them, but before she had a chance to address it, she was startled by slow, loud, and condescending applause echoing from around the corner. A long shadow rounded the corner, followed by Falson, in full royal regalia and sporting a smug expression. "A servant? Negotiate with the king?" he said wryly. "Preposterous. You do not possess the wits to do so." "Please, Sir Falson, I say—" "Please," he cut her off. "Now she says, please?" Safford moved in closer to Damori until he towered over her. This was it, she thought. Safford would draw his sword and strike her dead. He was a magnificent warrior and possessed the skills to end her life with one blow. Still, she might be able to deflect his sword if she mentally prepared for it now, but... No. She would not lift a hand against Safford. Damori closed her eyes and readied herself for a fatal blow. None came. Instead, Safford leaned in close to her ear so that no one else could hear his words. "Oh, go now," Safford said firmly. "Do not search for kindness in this man." His terse words were more of a confirmation than a warning. It was his attempt to steer her clear of Falson's wrath. Safford directed the two guards to take their places at the edge of the hall. He looked once more at Damori and narrowed his eyes. He wanted her to leave now. With him, allow Falson to dwell in his accomplishment, alone, where he could do no further harm. Damori was too stunned to notice his eyes and too afraid to turn her back to Falson. His men had taken their places and his presence had been felt. There was nothing more for Safford to do. He turned on his heels and marched away. As soon as Safford turned the corner, Falson snatched Damori's veil away and spat in her face. Tears streamed down her cheeks as she struggled to remain stoic and wiped away the fluid seeping from her narrowed nostrils. "You delusional, swarthy-skinned fool." His spittle sprayed Damori's veil as he leaned in closer. "I sit at the king's right hand. I am the first to have his ear. How foolish of you to think you could bully me." He backed away and let his moment of triumph sink in. He'd won. Damori had gambled and lost. He wanted her to feel every moment of pain and fear. He moved around her in circles, as if he were stalking her, watching her tremble as she wondered what would happen next. After 3 times around, he stopped and leaned into her ear again, so close his lips brushed against her ears as he whispered, "If you ever wish for Queen Shayla and Princess Mieko to have peace in their lives, you will bind your tongue regarding a certain matter. Speak of it again, and I will surely plan the most horrific of wedding nights for my beloved, and you will never Shayla again." Damori's fear shifted to anger, and she turned to face Falson and scowled at him. Her body shook with anger as she tried to stare him down. His gaze never shifted. His smirk never waned. He knew he'd won. Damori's temper tantrum was all show. She had no moves left. Damori slowly averted her eyes and lowered her head. Her shoulders slumped and she hunched weakly as if her spine had been broken. She barely lifted her head again to bow to Falson. "As you command," she weakly mumbled as she bowed so low she almost toppled over. As she limped away, she never felt more alone, vulnerable and useless. Her mind mentally weighed all the unfortunate events in her life. She was on the losing end again. She lost Shayla. She lost Mieko. Now the training that connected her to both Mieko and to King Kalin was taken from her, and she was powerless to do anything about it. The beauty that once filled Damori's life was spilling out before her very eyes like sand in a broken bottle. Now she finally understood the lifeless expressions of the servants and waitstaff. Despite Empress Shayla's loving kindness and the soft-hearted way she made requests of those who doted on her, the reality was that these men and women had no choice in their lives. Everything they did, every task from the time they awoke in the morning until they returned to their beds, exhausted, was chosen for them. The primary point of their existence was to please men like Falson. Sure, there were some pleasant times, some laughter, and even some rewards for jobs well done. Shayla always tried her best to be grateful and appreciative. However, the servants possessed no freedom. It was the light and energy of freedom that was missing from their lives. Damori stopped by a fountain in the outer courtyard and gazed at her reflection in the placid waters. The light in her eyes was gone. As her mind continued to weigh the events of recent weeks, she realized she possessed one last bastion of hope. She had one tactic to at least experience the power and spirit of freedom, albeit temporarily. She would take advantage of the uniqueness of her situation, grasp and hold on to that one thing with everything within her. Unlike other servants, Damori had once called the Queen Mother, and with privilege came certain allowances. Now she would see just how far she could stretch these allowances, hoping to feel some semblance of the joy she once felt in the process. If the gods were merciful, she could once again seek the feeling of freedom, although she was very much a slave.